Okay, hello everyone. Um, Thank you very much for joining us in this next session. We're going to be speaking about conducting pilot and feasibility trials. I might just take a small opportunity to thank everyone who's organized the conference and everyone who's spoken so far. It's been really fascinating. I think IB10 is a wonderful network. It's really providing us with great services. So with us today to discuss pilot and feasibility trials, we have Dr. Lehana Thabane, Professor Christine Bond, and Professor Ken Freedland. And after their 20-minute talks, we'll have a discussion moderated by Professor Simon Bacon and Professor Lynda Powell. So I'll just introduce the speakers in order, and then we will proceed with the talks. So I might introduce myself first. My name's Dr. Chris Noon. I'm a lecturer in the School of Psychology at the National University of Ireland in Galway. And I work with the Health Behaviour Change Research Group there, led by Professor Molly Byrne. So on to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Lehana Thabane, who is a professor of biostatistics and interim chair of the Department of Health Research Methods, Evidence and Impact. Associate member of the Department of Pediatrics and Anesthesia, School of Nursing and School of Rehabilitation Science in the Faculty of Health Sciences at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. He's also the Director of Biostatistics at St. Joseph's Healthcare, Hamilton, and Senior Scientist at the Population Health Research Institute at Hamilton Health Sciences. His research interests include clinical trials, biostatistical research, evidence synthesis methods, outcomes research, and health services research in prevention, treatment, and management of chronic conditions in primary care. And after Dr. Thabane speaks, we'll have Professor Christine Bond. Professor Bond is Emeritus Professor of Primary Care, Pharmacy, and past head of the Centre of Academic Primary Care at the University of Aberdeen. She's been awarded well over 100 grants and has over 250 publications related to a large portfolio of health services research on the evidence-based, cost-effective use of medicines, both prescribed and over-the-counter, drug misuse, the community pharmacist, general practitioner interface, and the wider healthcare agenda. She's a mixed methods researcher with a track record of designing RCTs developed systematically via appropriate feasibility and pilot work, and is a founding member of the Pilot and Feasibility Studies Working Group. She's editor of the International Journal of Pharmacy Practice, a trustee of Antibiotic Research UK, and associate editor for the Canadian Journal of Hospital Pharmacy. She is currently a member of Pharmacy Research UK Scientific Advisory Panel and chair of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain Science and Research Board. Finally, for our speakers, we have Professor Ken Freedland, who is Professor of Psychiatry and Psychology at Washington University School of Medicine, Editor-in-Chief of Health Psychology, and co-investigator and clinical supervisor for the multi-center Enhancing Recovery in Coronary Heart Disease, or ENRICHED. A co-investigator and assessment core leader for the multi-center Kodiak's Vanguard trial, and a co-investigator and clinical supervisor for the multi-center INSPIRE trial of stress management for lung transplant candidates. He's also a founding member of the Academy of Cognitive Therapy and an ACT certified cognitive therapy trainer, an instructor in clinical trial methodology on the faculty of the National Institutes of Health Annual Summer Institute and randomized behavioral clinical trials. Then our moderators, first we have Professor Simon Bacon. Simon is professor in the Department of Health Kinesiology and Applied Physiology at Concordia University, Canadian Institute of Health Research Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research, chair in Innovative Patient-Oriented Behavioral Clinical Trials, quite a mouthful, co-director of the Montreal Behavioral Medicine Centre, fellow of the Obesity Society and the Canadian Cardiovascular Society, and researcher at the Centre Intégré Universitaire de Santé et Services Sociaux du Nord de l'Île de Montréal, and co-lead of the International Behavioral Trials Network, as we all know. And finally, we come to Dr. Lynda Powell. Dr. Powell is the Charles J. and Margaret Roberts Professor of Preventive Medicine Medicine, Behavioral Sciences and Pharmacology, and chair of the Department of Preventive Medicine at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. She's been a past principal investigator on 5 major randomized behavioral trials and has served as a standing member of the NHLBI Clinical Trials Study Section. She was the principal investigator of the Chicago site of the NHLBI-sponsored obesity-related behavioral intervention trials, or ORBIT network, and co-developed the ORBIT model for behavioral treatment development. She's a founding faculty member in the NIH OBSSR-sponsored Summer Institute for Randomized Clinical Trials involving behavioral interventions. She will publish the first book on methods for behavioral randomized clinical trials for chronic diseases in 2020. So a very distinguished group of speakers. And let's start with Dr. Thabane's presentation whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Chris. I hope everybody can hear me well. If you can't, please send a text to Chris and his team. They will monitor what's happening. I'm going to talk about pilot and feasibility studies, and in particular, how to tell them apart.
Lehana, your mic is off. Your mic is, yeah, just have to put your microphone back on. It's bottom left.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Good. Now, I'm still not able to control the slides. Good. So this is joint work with the pilot and feasibility studies group, colleagues from the UK, and one of us, Christine, will also be talking to you shortly. Now, I'm going to start to talk in particular about the confusion that's in practice. I'll talk about the similarity between pilot and feasibility studies, and then I'll talk lastly about the differences and some of the things we've done to be able to help change the confusion that's happening in practice. Now, the reality is, as it currently states, even though things are changing, there's a lot of confusion in practice. What's happening is for a long time, there has been very substantial variation with a lot of pilot and feasibility studies, at least those that claim to be reported inconsistently with the name pilot and the term feasibility, in some cases used interchangeably and very inconsistently. We all know that in research, words do matter. And one of the things that unfortunately happens that most journals had no editorial policies of how to deal with pilot studies. And part of the challenges is that quite often when people don't do a good job and they submit something for publication, editors would often, twist them to add the word pilot to acknowledge the small sample size nature of the studies they're working with. And if people are really desperate to get something published, they just abide by what the editors are forcing them to do. Now, even those that get reported, the challenge is that they often emphasize hypothesis testing. And there's usually no clear feasibility objectives. There's no clear mention of what progression criteria would be used to be able to interpret the results as to whether the main study should proceed or not. And the analytic strategies don't often include analysis of the feasibility objectives or outcomes. But I guess of all these things, the tragedy is that there's never even an explicit mention that these studies are intended to inform the design of a future study. Of course, some have worried that in the era of diminishing resources, perhaps doing pilot studies is not a good use of resources. But on the contrary, the evidence from the UK seems to suggest that really doing pilot studies can save the system quite a substantial amount of money. In fact, there's a lot of empirical evidence showing that not doing piloting or assessment of feasibility is perhaps one of the primary reasons why studies fail. There's systematic reviews that have all shown that many of the studies that tend to terminate prematurely when this was not part of the plan is simply because of poor recruitment. So overall, if you look at what's happening, you'll actually find that the practice is inadequate, whether it's in the design, analysis, or reporting of pilot or feasibility studies in general. This led to us trying to figure out how to change the situation We thought we could actually provide a reporting guideline that can help improve the reporting of the studies, but immediately realized that we are actually in disagreement among ourselves as to whether pilot and feasibility studies meant the same thing. And therefore, we decided to start by trying to see whether we can have some consensus on what the definitions for a pilot study should be and what the definition for a feasibility study should be. And this led to the development of a framework which really guided the discussion after a series of consultations with various stakeholders who are all interested in trying to improve the field. Overall, the framework showed that when we're trying to do anything or study anything, especially in the context of trying to intervene, there's often a lot of uncertainty. And really, feasibility studies are about trying to reduce that uncertainty to be able to see whether the main study can be done. You could do it in the form of a single-arm study, a survey, or an assessment of whether people are satisfied with the intervention, or it could actually do as a miniature version of the main study itself. So there's various forms of how one could actually approach this issue. So there was consensus that there's a larger concept of feasibility, and within that larger concept, we could have different forms of different types of feasibility studies. And if it's a miniature version of the main study, then that would be a pilot study. And with that in mind, therefore, the feasibility study was defined as something that asks whether something can be done. Should we proceed with it? And if so, how should we proceed? While a feasibility study, a pilot study, was asking the same question about feasibility, but had a specific design feature that's similar to the main study to some extent. And therefore, with this, we came to a general understanding that pilot studies really are a small subset of feasibility studies. In other words, all pilot studies are feasibility studies, but not all feasibility studies could be considered pilot studies. With this framework, then one can think about the similarity between a pilot study or a feasibility study. And what really brings them together is the fact that they are all assessing feasibility. A good example is the BRAVE pilot trial that we worked on. And this was really trying to address the issue of whether we could actually conduct the main trial addressing the issue of depression. We all know that depression is a major condition that could lead to a lot of debilitation for people who have the condition, including serious consequences that could lead to death. And the quality of life for people who live with it is absolutely devastating. So we weren't sure whether we could be able to actually do a randomized controlled trial looking at activation group therapy to be able to address this issue. So what we did was we did it on a smaller scale and randomized to see whether we could recruit people, retain them, provide good complete data, and get some feedback about the intervention. And part of why we are doing this is while there's a lot known about various other interventions for depression, when you do activation therapy in a group setting, there's very little known about it. A second example looking at this issue of feasibility is the cluster randomized trial that we did in long-term cares. There's a lot of evidence about really how to provide good care for people in long-term. They're all elderly people with lots of comorbid conditions, and many of them are quite frail, and bone health becomes an essential element which helps to be able to reduce the risk of fractures or risk of falls. And the use of vitamin D and appropriate therapies for reducing the risk of osteoporosis are essential because we all know the evidence that these things, if used appropriately and for people who really are indicated for it, they could be helpful. We didn't know whether we could recruit all the homes and if all the homes would be able to allow us to implement the intervention as designed, and what issues would have about getting data complete and so on. And therefore, we decided to first start with a pilot trial assessing issues of recruitment and retention. Notice that so far, everything is still about whether we could collect something that can help us to be able to see whether we can design the main study. A third example is a pilot trial that was actually done to assess whether providing some intervention to be able to help people who are drug users in Puerto Rico could actually help. One of the challenges is that, people who are drug users, they tend to contaminate all the tools that they use to be able to inject drugs in themselves, and the syringes and the way they actually prepare things tend to actually get contaminated, and this often leads to more problems and infections among them. So this was an intervention intended to really provide a very systematic way of helping them to be able to do this in a much more safe manner, using sanitization, and the way they actually inject themselves would be safe. But it wasn't sure whether this could actually be done safely in a trial, and therefore they did it on a smaller scale. It was a non-intervention, it was an interventional study, but not randomized. So even though they really call it a pilot, this could have been seen as a feasibility study, because the main study ultimately would have used a randomized control version. The fourth example really has to do with, I'm now not able to move the slides, if you can help.
Lehana, you probably just, there you go. You're back in.
Good. They just moved forward. So this is a feasibility study, not a pilot study. And it was an example of a small feasibility study that was really intended to inform the design of a larger trial. And the trial really had to do with whether they could actually do a surgical trial where they're trying to correct some of the deformities of the femoral head or neck deformities. And there's a lot of these studies happening, but quite often the argument was that when they submit trials for funding, the reviewers would often ask, is there a feasibility that surgeons would want to do this, or even patients themselves would want to do it? So the investigator decided to start with a very small feasibility study, trying to actually see whether surgeons and patients would provide a favorable view towards performing such a surgical trial. So all this really are examples of miniature versions of main studies, which are pilot, and assessment of feasibility that don't necessarily have the main feature as the main trial itself. It's not moving again. Good. So really the key message is that they're all assessing feasibility. Some have the same feature as the main study, while others are really either based on surveys or based on something else that may not necessarily have the same feature as the main trial. So how can you then tell them apart? I'm struggling to move the slides again. Oh, it's moving. So remember I said earlier on, according to the framework, not all feasibility studies are pilot studies. While in fact, it just showed that pilot studies and feasibility study have something similar, that they're all looking at feasibility. So the pilot are the miniature version of the main study, but feasibilities don't necessarily have to have the same design. And I'm going to illustrate with examples showing that they really don't have to have the same design as the main study. This was the prospect pilot trial that we did. One of the unfortunate realities of people who end up in ICU is that they often would have challenges with ventilator-related pneumonia. And there's studies showing that one of the ways to actually prevent this is to enhance the microbiota, which can enhance the gut barrier situation that can help to reduce the risk of these infections. We weren't sure whether this could actually be done in the ICU setting. We did a pilot, and then ultimately we did the main study. Can you help with the slides, please? So this was the protocol for the main trial. And in the end, we just wanted to show you that the pilot itself had its primary objective, the feasibility. Can you please help with the slides? Maybe I'll just say the next slide and somebody can help to move them.
Lehana, I think it's just that the issue might be just a slight lag from when you press. There may be a slight slowness in the system, so I think it's just taking an extra second before it kicks in.
Hi, this is Jen. I'm actually moving the slide, so just tell me next slide and I'll do it. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Next slide, please. Just there's some animations in this slide. So the primary focus for the pilot phase was really about recruitment, which are all about feasibility, adherence, and contamination. Next slide, please. And we also had progression criteria of how we would move on to the main study. Next slide, please. And as you can see, the design was similar to what was going to be in the main study. So this would be a typical pilot trial because it has the same design as the main one. Next slide, please. The next example is the earlier one that I mentioned about femoral deformities of the neck and the head. And this was actually done as a pilot to be as a feasibility to see whether patients would have favorable opinion of doing the main trial. And patients would also share the same thing. Next slide, please. Thank you, Chris. And this were the results of the main trial. The next slide, please. And the next table really shows that you can now look side by side between the feasibility and the main trial. Next slide, please. The primary objectives and outcomes for the feasibility were different. And while in fact for the main trial, next slide, please. They were looking at something else. One of the things I wanted to highlight is that because of the variation in practice, many of these studies don't often have criteria for progression to the main study. Next slide, please. And as you can see, the feasibility was a survey, while the main trial was a power group design. Next slide, please. Another good example was the complex rehab intervention in ICU. It's done by some of my colleagues at the School of Rehab, led by one of my wonderful colleagues, Michelle Cole. Next slide, please. The reality of people in ICU is that it's a very difficult situation to be in, but a lot of people really survive it. Next slide, please. And quite often is when they survive, they tend to live with serious disability. Some of the things may have occurred while they were in the rehab. Next slide, please. And the evidence seems to show that part of the problem is that rehab takes too long to take place, and by the time they come out of ICU, it's already too late for this to happen. Next slide, please. So there's some evidence showing that the earlier we could start physical rehab for people in ICU, the better. Next slide, please. And the next slide, please. So the cycle program was really intended to assess whether doing this rehab cycle for people in ICU much earlier would actually work. We then began to realize that there were a lot of things we were not aware of in terms of how they might work. Next slide, please. So we looked at the literature. Next slide, please. And then we assessed feasibility using different versions. Next slide, please. All those were used to design the main trial. Next slide, please. And then we packaged some of the lessons learned about some of the methods issues. Next slide, please. And the first thing that we did was to actually assess by looking at people's opinion as to whether this would work. Next slide, please. And then we did one site feasibility. Next slide, please. And then the next slide. This were intended to then provide a miniature version of the main trial, which will be multi-center to see whether it will work. Next slide, please. So we then really, as a group, worked hard to try and see whether we could actually change the practice. And one of the things we're getting was that there's no platform to publishing such studies. Next slide, please. We then developed a journal which was launched in 2015. Next slide, please. Jill and I have been co-editing the journal. Next slide, please. And the group had been fundamental in really supporting the development of the journal, and they have been the board members from the beginning. Next slide, please. And then we started first by publishing the concept extension to pilot trials, which we published in BMJ and in the new journal that we started. Next slide, please. And then, of course, what we did, we also developed the website to be able to synthesize all the information that's been published on pilot studies in order to enhance practice. Next slide, please. There's still a lot of things that still up for discussion, needs to be ironed out or clarified, because there's still some confusions about pilot trials. And these are some of the things that we hope we could discuss as to whether those studies that use surrogate endpoints are really pilot, and how strong should the aspiration of the main trial to be for something to be called a feasibility. Can you just do a feasibility with the hope that somebody else can actually do the trial? So these are some of the things perhaps we may take up for discussion. Next slide, please. Overall, I think this has been able to at least give you a sense of where pilot and feasibilities are similar and where they are different, with the hope that as we are able to clarify the language, this can help us enhance the practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our next talk will follow directly from this, and that will be Professor Christine Bond.
Okay, I'll start again then. So I was just saying, thank you so much for asking me to come to Montreal. I was really looking forward to coming and to networking with everyone, but of course here I am in Aberdeen. It is actually gloriously sunny today, but I'm clearly not in those wonderful university buildings, nor am I out enjoying the countryside. I'm in my home office talking to all of you. So I hope this works all right. It's such a shame it hasn't really been able to come and meet everybody. So what I want to do today is to revisit some of the points that Lehana has told you about the difference between pilot and feasibility studies, and talk a little bit more about the conduct of a pilot trial, building on that checklist that he mentioned towards the end of his slide. But also to reiterate that we didn't start off thinking about the conceptual framework. We did start off, as he indicated, thinking that if we could develop a checklist to encourage people to recognize the right objectives for pilot studies and the right way to report them, we would both increase the number of these that were published for everyone's benefit, but we'd also increase their sort of perceived value in the hierarchy of research studies. So although this talk is about conducting studies, I'm very much focusing on that reporting checklist to highlight a few areas which you really need to think about. And the reason for that is that if you don't know that those items are going to be asked for when you report them, there's a chance that you won't actually do a study which will allow you to collect the data that you need. So when we started off thinking about the checklist, we didn't start from scratch. We went to the consort checklist for randomized controlled trials, noted that there were many extensions already for different study types, and took that checklist for the basic checklist and mapped some of the more recently published pilot and feasibility studies onto that checklist. And as a group, you've seen the members of the group. As a group, we decided how we would adapt the consort items to meet the needs of a pilot and feasibility study. But it wasn't just our thoughts. We then went to the wider research community and included publishers and funders with a very extensive Delphi exercise followed by a stakeholder meeting. And after many, many iterations, we actually came up with our final checklist, which Lehana's already shown you, which was published in the BMJ and in Lehana's journal, Pilot and Feasibility Studies. So what I'm going to do now in the next slides, I'm going to show you a slide with a section of the checklist. The first two columns on the left and for going from left to right are the original checklist items in the main consort checklist. The furthest right column, the third column, is how we've adapted those items for pilot trials. And the red text shows the actual change we've made to the original item. And sometimes we've actually added a new item. So on this slide, I want to particularly focus on the issue that comes when you're planning your study. You're getting your research questions right, And it's really important that this is a pilot trial, you get the pilot objectives clearly laid out. And as with any study, the research question should absolutely dictate the way that study develops, how you design it, how you agree what outcomes you're going to collect, and how you analyze those outcomes. So taking a step back and thinking a bit more about what Lehana said, what might be the main uncertainties for a future trial that you need to test out in that pilot trial? I've just put quite a few things onto this slide. Some of these areas you might already have confirmed or finalized in your mind through earlier feasibility work. And that really, so Lehana has given examples of feasibility where you were looking at whether or not a particular intervention would be acceptable to clinicians and patients. You might already have the service specification for your intervention absolutely finalized. You know exactly how it's going to be delivered. But you won't know until you try in a pilot trial whether or not people will be willing to be randomized to either an intervention or a control group. You won't know whether it's possible to blind perhaps your researchers to the outcome measures as they collect them. And there's various other things that you might well be looking at in this pilot trial. So I'm going to give you here an example from a care home study looking at introducing a nutritional intervention. And here this study actually had about 10 different areas of uncertainty it wanted to explore in this pilot trial. It divided them into primary and secondary objectives. And I've shown the primary ones here, and I just want to focus to illustrate the point on the first two. So this was a study in care homes, which was done when many care homes were not necessarily used to taking part in research. And it was important for the research team to know how many care homes were likely to take part in the main trial. Would they accept the invitation to participate? And then particularly thinking about care home residents who are often very old, frail, and often lack capacity. Were the eligibility criteria that have been defined a priori the correct ones? Were they too open? Were too many people being allowed into the trial who actually didn't need any nutritional intervention? Or were the people so frail and the criteria are so restrictive that the actual participants might not survive the 6 months in which was needed to collect the follow-up data? So really important to look, if you're doing something in a new setting or with new participants, how likely they are to take part. So moving on to the next block of checklist items, in this set here, which are starting to think about how you conducted the trial design, we've added a new one, which is how the participants are identified and consented. And this is something that's really important to think about in a pilot trial, because historically, I think a lot of people have thought that in a pilot trial, you can just ask a mate to recruit people from his clinic just to test out your ideas, or you maybe even know the participants from a small network you're working with. And if you think about it, if your pilot trial is to assess something like recruitment or retention, using friends to do that pilot will give you a very false sense of security that things are going to be all right. Further, you really need to know exactly what was done and make sure that when you do think about how you're going to identify and consent patients, this is something that can be scaled up to a larger study. So you don't want something too intensive that won't work. So I've got an example here of a mindfulness-based intervention for people with inflammatory bowel disease done by colleagues in Aberdeen. And here they identified eligible patients from clinic records, but then some were mailed out invitation packs in the post and others were approached individually in clinics. And actually what the researchers found was that very few people actually were invited through the face-to-face clinic route. That just didn't happen. And from the mail out, they did get their sufficient numbers, but on the other hand, they had a really low response rate. And so when they moved on, they used a completely different approach. So I now want to remind you again that the main objectives of a pilot trial are assessing those areas of uncertainty. So in a main efficacy trial, your main outcomes are going to be all about testing whether or not the intervention works. But in a pilot trial, this is completely different. This is about finding out whether or not you've got the outcomes to address the objectives that you've got. So this is very much about, if you're looking at wanting to know whether you can get people to take part, response rates, whether you can get them to be retained in the study for the duration, you need to make sure that you have an outcome that matches that. So I think Lehana mentioned, and I have also seen papers which are flagged up as pilot trials, and they say they're about feasibility of things like recruitment and retention, but actually when they list the outcomes they list are the clinical outcomes. They don't have an outcome specified to address their feasibility objectives. And another thing to think about here is if you are thinking about how easy is it to recruit people and you're depending on clinic staff to hand out those invitations, you need to know what that denominator is. So unfortunately, I have very bad experience, and not just once, where clinic staff have agreed to hand out invitations for me. We've had really low response rates. And then when we've looked into it, we've seen that a lot of our invitation packs are still sitting in people's offices. So it's really important that you make sure that you get all that information and are clear exactly how many have been sent out when you want to assess how many people have been recruited. Sorry, I should have done that. So the example I wanted to give here, though, of an outcome to address one of the objectives, one of the areas of uncertainty, is actually slightly different from those slightly easy to understand ones about recruitment rates or retention rates. So acceptability is often something that's going to be also assessed in a pilot trial, although often it might be done earlier, as in Lehana's example. It's normally done with some qualitative or semi-qualitative approach like interviews or questionnaires. But this is an unusual study to show you because it's about using an online environment to support pediatric patients with type 1 diabetes. So because it's an online environment, within the digital software, it has an ability to actually log how many people access the environment and how many people repeatedly accessed it and whether there were any problems. So they were able to define acceptability in terms of the usage and repeated usage of the online environment. So this gave them a much more, I guess, objective assessment of whether people really would use this intervention. So, but obviously that's not always possible, but it's quite interesting to see how they've, I guess, maximize the facility within the intervention. So coming back to thinking about the outcomes that will address our objectives, we also need to think about how we report them. So in the main consort, there's this emphasis on the statistical methods to compare the groups of the primary and secondary outcomes, because that main trial is all about showing differences between groups. But what we have in our pilot trial checklist is a softer approach, saying the methods, and this is recognizing two things. Firstly, that sometimes, as I just said in the previous slide, the pilot trial objective is being assessed by a qualitative method. And so if this is an interview, you need to have very clearly in your plan, and as you think about how you're going to conduct this study, the approach to analyzing those qualitative data sets. If they're quite in-depth interviews, you must be clear at the beginning if you're going to have a theoretical framework to underpin the analysis, or whether you're just going to use a basic content analysis. That all needs to be thought through at this conduct stage. And of course, if you're going to be reporting numerical data, then that's probably easier. But to remember, this mustn't be about comparison. It's all about just giving straight figures with no tests of significance. So this is a study that Lehana was involved with, where they were looking at different neural blocks and looking at the role of anesthetic volume and concentration. And they were very clear when they were planning this study that although they were going to collect information on clinical outcomes as well as the feasibility outcomes of recruitment and retention, they were only going to use descriptive statistics, means for continuous outcomes and raw counts for categorical outcomes. They were not going to report any effect sizes. So moving on, another thing that you need to think about in your pilot study compared to a main study is the numbers that you report. And so in the original consort checklist, building on to completing your consort flowchart, the data that you start to collect is the number of participants who actually randomly assigned the numbers who went into each group, as well as then how many received the intended treatment and were analysed for the primary outcome. In a pilot trial, you also need to know how many people were screened for eligibility, because this is really important to help in that pilot stage understand the size of the available population that might be out there to use for your main trial. So, for example, if you were wanting to look at improving the treatment of patients with coronary heart disease, in your pilot trial, you're just looking for people suboptimally controlled, then it would be quite easy probably to quite readily find the small number of patients you might need for your pilot trial. But you also want to know that if you move on to the main trial, if you were recruiting, say, from a family practice, of a population of 10,000 patients in a family practice, how many of those would actually be eligible for your trial? Because that means then that you can understand how many centres you might need to recruit as you move forward into the main trial, and assess whether or not that number is actually realistic. So the template that we have in the checklist for the participant flow diagram, instead of starting here at the randomized point, which is where the main consort flow chart starts, we start at the screening stage. I didn't mean to move on. So we start up here at the screening stage. You need to know how many people were screened, then how many were excluded, then how many were assessed for eligibility, then how many were excluded, which really allows us to know the actual size of the available population that we can then be using as we go into the main trial. And I expect many people have done trials where they've seen how sadly they had this very optimistic idea of how many eligible participants are out there. Normally, my experience is you probably get 25% of them. So I want to move on quickly to remind you again about the main, I guess, philosophy behind a pilot study, that it is all about uncertainty, whether that's about recruitment and adherence or whether it's about how you collect the data, but it's not about comparing or deciding whether a study works. And so when it comes to the actual analysis, we've got the analysis plan already agreed, but we're now actually thinking about how we're going to analyze it. We mustn't be tempted to report differences in groups, even if they look really hopeful. We have to really restrain ourselves and make sure that for each objective, we give the results, including expressions of uncertainty. If relevant, these can be by randomized group. But remember, in a pilot trial, these are small sample sizes. This hasn't been powered, and it is really dangerous if you don't give those confidence intervals around your estimates to make very wrong decisions. So this is an interesting example I've picked out here, though, to show you. So this was an intervention which was using a new lifestyle referral assessment for people with cardiovascular disease. And whilst their original feasibility, their main feasibility outcomes were about retention and recruitment, they also had as a secondary outcome proof of concept, which is a slightly Weasley word, I suppose. And so as part of that proof of concept idea, they have reported for each arm the number of people who changed their lifestyle and given the odds ratios around that. And so it does suggest, I guess, that the intervention has improved things. But when you look at the wide confidence intervals that they do report, and they haven't done sort of specific statistical comparisons, you can see that there's a lot of uncertainty around that conclusion. So finally, when you're doing that study and you've done the analysis, what do you hope to conclude? As you go through that conduct, you must be really aware as you go through it of the limitations of your pilot compared to what might be happening in a main trial. And you need to be alert to any remaining areas of uncertainty that emerge as you go through the study. You need to think how generalizable what you've done is to the pilot trial. You've done all your best things you could as you started the planning and the conduct to make sure it was going to be generalizable, but inevitably there will be things as you go through it that you realize you might not be able to take forward into a main trial. But most importantly, what are the implications of what you found for progression? So remember, the pilot trial is all about making a decision about whether to proceed to the next stage. And the next stage may be a main trial. You may have sorted out all those areas of uncertainty, or it may be a main trial with modifications, or it may be just yet another feasibility. So this is not a linear process of working through these stages. Sometimes you have to recognize you need to go backwards to go forwards again. So I want to end with a sort of story about this decision trial, which was a study of an educational intervention for family doctors to improve the use of antibiotics in acute respiratory tract infections. And the objective was to assess the feasibility and acceptability of the design, the procedures, and the intervention. But they very rashly, I think, set themselves very clear criteria which would decide whether or not they would go on to the main trial. They said that they wanted 50% of the family medicine groups that they approached to participate. And they wanted the family physicians who were in those groups to 70% of those to attend all 3 workshops. And they looked at satisfaction as well and missing data. But what they found was that sadly, only 24% of the family medicine groups agreed to take part. And then they concluded, although they had these pre-specified criteria, actually, well, not reaching those criteria didn't really mean it was unfeasible, but rather we just needed to make changes, which I think is fair enough, but I think maybe you need to be really clear when you pre-specify those criteria, how you're going to apply them. So what did they do? Well, in the same year as they published the feasibility study, they published the protocol for the main trial. And in that, they indicated that they'd done a successful feasibility study, but they might need to make modifications. A year later, they published the outcome of their trial, which was successful. They did improve the prescribing of antibiotics. And in that, they made clear that actually they had moved from family medicine groups as their recruitment approach to using teaching units. And I think I would argue that actually a trial done just using teaching units of doctors rather than the more general population of family physicians perhaps doesn't suggest this would necessarily be generalizable beyond those units. But nonetheless, they did progress and have a successful trial. So very finally, I think it's important to highlight the fact that although this is a pilot trial that you're conducting, it is a trial. It's really important that it should be registered with a recognized trial registry. It's really important that it has a protocol and that protocol is publicly available if needed. And it has to have ethical approval. That might sound obvious, but I still know people who think, well, it's just a pilot trial, we can try it out, we don't need to get ethical approval. So just to reiterate, the key points about conducting and analysing your pilot trial is that you must have research objectives that reflect uncertainty, not effectiveness. Your design has to address those objectives and the analysis must link back to those objectives. And the main trial may not always be justified, but think what Lehana said about the importance of doing this pilot trial, because if a main one isn't justified, think how much information, how much money you've saved. And to remind you again, as Lehana has said, these are little adverts that we have this website which has lots of massively interesting and useful resources on it if you're doing these sorts of studies, and Lehana's journal. And again, to say thank you to our team. It's a great team to work with. We've been together for 7 years and led very ably by Sandra Eldridge in the top right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bond. That was very interesting. We now have our final talk before we move on to the discussion. So can we welcome Professor Kenneth Freedland.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers, and I am very grateful to be on this panel with the people who have really led the way in showing us how pilot and feasibility studies should be done. I'm going to focus more on how they should not be done, because both as a grant reviewer and as a journal editor, I run into this frequently. So the talk that I'm going to give today is based on a paper that is in press in health psychology. Hopefully it will be published very soon, but this is a paper about pilot trials in health-related behavioral intervention research. I'm going to be focusing on some key elements in this paper, and there are other issues that I discuss in the paper that I will not have time to talk about today. So across many different areas of intervention research, pilot studies have traditionally been designed to serve as what are called preliminary efficacy trials, or PETs. PETs are essentially miniature randomized controlled trials that are intentionally underpowered and typically severely underpowered. I'm not talking about trials that were supposed to be adequately powered but were plagued by under-enrollment. I'm talking about studies that were deliberately underpowered. Many preliminary efficacy trials yield disappointing efficacy results, and in the process, they stifle work not only on useless interventions, but on promising ones as well. And PETs with pleasing results are often taken as giving a green light to a larger efficacy trial proposal, whether or not the feasibility issues have all been addressed. And also, preliminary efficacy trial effect sizes are often used as inputs into the power analyses for proposed full-fledged randomized controlled trials. But this approach has some serious drawbacks, and the previous speakers have alluded to some of them. But one of the key things is that only a very small proportion of published preliminary efficacy trials have ever led to a full-fledged RCT. By my estimate, I would say it's less than 10% and probably a lot less. Another thing about them is that people think that if you get a positive result in a preliminary efficacy trial, that is more or less guarantees that the larger RCT that you have in mind is also going to yield positive results. I would say to the contrary, many small trials with positive results have been followed by larger trials with negative results. And nevertheless, despite their glaring weaknesses and their lack of replication, preliminary efficacy trials are often said to have important implications for clinical practice, and they're sometimes cited as such. So because of all of those problems, my position is that preliminary efficacy trials do much more harm than good for the cause of evidence-based behavioral medicine. And yet, many researchers and reviewers still believe, and this is contrary to everything that Lehana and Christine and the consort checklist and so forth are saying. Many researchers still believe, and reviewers still believe, that pilot studies are supposed to serve as preliminary efficacy trials, and that proposals for full-fledged randomized controlled trials should or even must include positive preliminary efficacy findings. And the thinking goes that reports that are published of preliminary efficacy trials add to rather than detract from the research literature. Preliminary efficacy trials are also problematic for journal editors. We get cover letters that sound to us kind of like this. We, the authors, are submitting to you a severely underpowered preliminary efficacy trial, but please take it seriously as if it were a full-fledged RCT. But please give us a break. It's only a pilot study after all, so don't hold it to the same standards as you would a full-fledged RCT. There's no way to abide this kind of a self-contradictory plea for special dispensation. So are there any alternatives to this? Well, Helena Kramer and her colleagues have written eloquently about why we should not use preliminary efficacy trial effect sizes as inputs into RCT power analyses. But their work hasn't really fully fleshed out, well, what should we do instead if we're not going to do that? And also, how can we convince reviewers to fund our RCT proposals if we don't give them some pleasing preliminary efficacy trial data? Well, Kramer et al. Argue that instead of using a preliminary efficacy trial effect size as our input, we should define and justify a threshold of clinical significance and use that in the power analysis. The TCS is the smallest between group effect size that would matter in some meaningful way. For example, an effect as large as the TCS would be big enough to disturb clinical equipoise among experts in the field, or perhaps it would be big enough to encourage further research through a larger trial, or perhaps it would be big enough to justify changes in clinical practice. There are a variety of different ways to think about what would be the smallest between group effect size that would make a difference. Depends on what you're trying to accomplish at the stage of research. So if you think about planning a hypothetical RCT, here's a depression trial, and we go into it defining the TCS. What's the smallest difference between the intervention and control arm that would be big enough to matter? And that's to say that a smaller difference than that wouldn't matter, even if it's statistically significant. So you have to ask when you do that, why would an effect that's at least this large matter? To whom would it matter? Who is the audience that you're speaking to? And why would anything less than that not matter to them? I want to point out, for those of you who saw Dr. Powell's talk yesterday, that this between group difference that you're looking at, it matters where that between group difference is. Do the intervention participants, do they fall below some sort of clinically meaningful cutoff, like a cutoff for remission? Or does everybody fall above or below that in both arms? That's a point that I'm going to return to in a moment. But the basic point here is when you define a threshold of clinical significance, you have to think about why does something that big or that small matter, and to whom does it matter? So in general, what is called a preliminary efficacy trial can't answer those sorts of questions. And so they're really irrelevant for you when you're trying to define a threshold of clinical significance. Where do you get TCS values if you don't get them from little pilot studies? They come from a variety of sources. You may draw on epidemiological or clinical research findings. You may point to the long-term goals of your clinical research program about what you're trying to achieve and why you're trying to achieve it. You may draw on stakeholder and cost effectiveness perspectives, needs assessments, and so forth. There are a lot of different ways to arrive at a threshold. Now, Kramer et al. Recommend that we use a particular effect size index, which they call the success rate difference, to define the threshold of clinical significance for a trial. And you use the success rate difference in the power analysis, and you also use it for between group comparisons. And fortunately, the SRD translates into more familiar and interpretable effect size indices, such as the number needed to treat. They recently published an excellent tutorial that helps make sense out of all of this. So the SRD is remarkably versatile. It can be used with continuous, categorical, and time to event outcomes. And going back to Lynda's talk, that means that you can use the SRD both for the difference between intervention and control arms on a continuous measure, such as, let's say, the Beck Depression Inventory, as well as on whether or not participants fall above or below a cutoff, such as a remission threshold. And so it can serve both kinds of purposes. And it's essentially equal to the difference in the probability of who's going to have a better outcome, the person in the treatment arm or the person in the comparison arm. So if every success defined that way is somebody in the treatment arm, then the success rate difference value is equal to 1. Conversely, if every success is somebody in the control arm, then the SRD value is -1. And if there's absolutely no difference between the groups, then SRD equals 0. So when you're planning a trial, you're usually hoping that the SRD is going to be somewhere between 0 and 1, +1. And you can see from the chart on the right, and this is taken from Kramer et al.'s 2020 paper, that the SRD can be converted into a Cohen's d, it can be converted into a number needed to treat, it can be converted into a hazard ratio. So it's extremely versatile. Now, what about plausibility? By defining a threshold of clinical significance in your trial, you're basically telling reviewers that the efficacy effect size will have to be at least that large for the results to have much of an impact. Now, what kind of an impact you want it to have depends on the goals and the phase of the research program and the primary purpose or specific aims of your study. You're also telling reviewers that you're not going to conclude that the intervention is efficacious unless the observed effect is as large or larger than the threshold of clinical significance. In other words, statistical significance alone is not enough. And so consequently, reviewers are going to need to know why you think there's a good chance that the observed effect in your proposed trial is going to be at least as large as the threshold of clinical significance. And how do you convince them of that if you don't give them preliminary efficacy data? What you have to do is persuade them that an effect as large as the TCS is a plausible or a very plausible outcome of the proposed trial. Again, preliminary efficacy trials aren't really designed to make plausibility arguments. They have a faulty implicit logic that usually goes something like this. Our little miniature preliminary efficacy trial showed that our treatment is efficacious. And since the trial was so small, our treatment must be really good. Otherwise, we wouldn't have found an effect that was significant in such a small trial. And we now need to do a big trial just to confirm that our treatment is as good as we've already shown it to be. And our big trial will almost certainly show positive results because our little trial already showed positive results. I think you can tell how many faults there are in the logic of this. What about plausibility as an alternative to try to argue that way? Well, something is plausible if it seems reasonable, credible, believable, likely to be true. And asserting that an expected effect, something that you're hypothesizing, is a plausible outcome of a proposed trial is very different than arguing that it's essentially a sure thing. Basically, it's a sure thing is the argument that you're making when you use data from a preliminary efficacy trial. Well, the principle of equipoise suggests that it would be unethical and pointless to conduct a clinical trial if there were little or no doubt about how it would turn out. It's essentially like recruiting a bunch of skydivers and randomizing them to have a parachute or not to have a parachute, and then comparing the mortality rates to find out whether parachutes work. That's not a trial anybody would really want to do. And preliminary data can't really guarantee that a trial will turn out well. At best, it can be used to argue that a favorable outcome is a plausible or a very plausible outcome of the trial. Where do you get evidence of plausibility? One place you get it is from the scientific credibility of the intervention. If your intervention is grounded in basic science and T1 translation, and if it's embedded in a translational or intervention optimization framework, such as ORBIT or MOST, or the science of behavior change, that helps to establish its credibility. And if it's undergone systematic development, testing, and refinement, that helps. And also, literature showing that the threshold that you've established is incrementally and not dramatically better than what's been achieved before in previous studies or in similar interventions. That's very helpful because we don't tend to make dramatic breakthroughs. We tend to make, at best, incremental progress. So you don't want to be making wild, exaggerated claims about how great your intervention is, so much better than anything that's ever been done before. You're basically hoping to show that you can do a little better than what's been done before. Another place to get plausibility data is from proof of concept studies, from uncontrolled trials or from N of 1 studies, suggesting that an effect as large as the threshold of clinical significance is probably attainable. And beyond the supporting evidence, of course, an effect as large as the threshold won't seem plausible unless the reviewers think that the trial is going to be well designed and well conducted, that it's feasible, and that it's rigorous. And so all of those elements come to bear on whether reviewers are going to think that what you're proposing is plausible. And so here's the situation that you're in when you're proposing a trial. You've defined a threshold of clinical significance, which is the gray bar. And then when you talk about the plausibility of finding an effect that big, what are the reviewers going to think? If you are only able to give them evidence or argument that, well, what we need to achieve is a success rate difference of 0.2, but nothing that's come before this study leads me or anyone else to think that we can do that well. We think that if we do this trial, the best we can hope to achieve is smaller than the threshold of clinical significance. The reviewers aren't going to go for it. They're not going to think that this trial is worth doing. But if you are able to show from preliminary evidence, previous studies, and so forth, that there's a reasonably good chance that the outcome that you're going to get out of this trial is at least as large as the TCS, or maybe even a little larger, then they think, well, there's a chance, there's a good chance that you can achieve a clinically meaningful difference between the groups. And so that gives the reviewers the sense that, hey, this seems like maybe a trial that's worth doing. So when you're making the case for your trial, you define the threshold of clinical significance. You have to convince the reviewers that it's well chosen and that it's an effect that would be worth finding at, again, whatever stage of research you're at, whatever the situation is with the problem you're trying to treat, whatever you're trying to accomplish. The rationale for that threshold is different from one study to the next or one phase to the next. But whatever it is, find evidence to support it and argue that it's the right threshold for what you're trying to accomplish. And then you have to convince the reviewers that you have a reasonably good chance of finding. No guarantee that you'll find it, but the chance is good enough that you have a basis for moving ahead to a trial. Proper pilot studies like the ones that Lehana and Christine talked about, the ones that evaluate the feasibility of an RCT, can be extremely valuable, as you have seen, but they're not going to help you define the threshold of clinical significance for your trial. They won't provide much of the evidence. They'll provide some, perhaps, but not much of the evidence you'll need to support your plausibility argument. And they really shouldn't provide preliminary efficacy data. So translational research and optimization frameworks such as ORBIT, MOST, the science behavior change, the behavior change wheel, and so forth, can show that a variety of different kinds of studies can help to lay the groundwork for trials. In general, these frameworks don't recommend preliminary efficacy trials. And contrary to the traditional and still popular belief, preliminary efficacy trials are not the be-all and the end-all of preliminary research on behavioral interventions. In fact, we'll be much better off without them. When you're leading up to a large behavioral trial, there are all kinds of different studies that you can do, but preliminary efficacy trials need not and should not be one of those preliminary studies. But the battle is joined. It's not over yet. Some grant reviewers know that preliminary efficacy trials are problematic, but others don't. and some may want, encourage, or expect you to provide preliminary efficacy trial data. And as Kenny Rogers said in a famous song, you got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, and know when to run. So there's a point at which you want to argue with reviewers about these kinds of issues, and a point at which you need to make some concessions and figure out how to compromise. But in general, I would ask you, please help educate reviewers, colleagues, and trainees that preliminary efficacy trials are obsolete and counterproductive, and also that there are better alternatives. And I would urge you to look at some of these newer translational and optimizational frameworks, such as Orbit and MOST, for inspiration about how to lay the groundwork for full-fledged randomized controlled trials. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Freedland. That was another fascinating talk. So I'll hand over to Professor Bacon now for the start of the discussion.
Yeah, if the all the speakers would like to turn their cameras on, it's actually Professor Powell who is going to kick us off with the first question. But before you do, maybe Lynda, can I want to reiterate Ken's point about how phenomenal a panel this is, and actually including Ken. I don't want to do you a disservice. Really, this is stuff that we've been struggling with, I think, in the behavioral world, as highlighted by Ken's talk, and Christine and Lehana, the work that you guys have been doing within the PAF group has been really exceptional and really, you know, blazing a trail that we've been able to follow through, I think, and it gives us great hope that we can do things better from our perspective. Sorry, go ahead, Lynda.
Okay, I agree. This was a fascinating panel, and I'm really impressed with all of these talks. I want to speak from the point of view of a young investigator who wants to get into behavioral clinical trial research of some type or another. The paper by Helena Kramer that came out that said we can't use effect sizes from pilot studies to estimate, to use in our estimates of sample size in a subsequent RCT, shook the daylights out of everybody, because that's what we have always done. We've always done pilot studies and looked at effect sizes and filtered them into power calculations, and everything was fine. So now what you're telling us is we're not supposed to do that. And that creates such a void for so many people about how am I going to figure out how big a sample I should have in my RCT. So I'm sending this out to all of the presenters to respond to this, because as an investigator, when I first heard this, it created great anxiety on my part, because I didn't know where to turn. And when we talk about, is this going to disrupt clinical equipoise? I don't know. I don't know what that is. I don't know how to figure that out. So what I'm asking is, can you dig into what is the best alternative? And in so doing that, you know, what's the difference between a PET and a proof of concept study and a phase 2 efficacy trial? All this stuff is now kind of coming at us fast, but how do I figure out sample size for my RCT? That's what I want to know as a new investigator, which I'm not.
Lynda, I think you're asking the critical question. I think this is why we still keep seeing preliminary efficacy trials, because people think it's the right thing to do and they don't know what else to do. They don't know how to make the case for doing a trial, and they don't know what they're supposed to use in their power analysis. Using a threshold of clinical significance as the input into a power analysis, I think the best information I could offer on that is to read Kramer et al.'s papers on this subject. It goes into that in a much better way than I possibly could. But the fact is, the difference is the threshold of clinical significance is not necessarily something that you happen to observe in a smaller pilot study. In fact, it's not necessarily something that happens to have come out of a previous big trial or out of a nice big meta-analysis. That tells you what's been done before. It doesn't necessarily tell you what you need to do now. The effect size that you're chasing now needs to be thought about long and hard. Why do I need an effect size this big? Why would anything smaller not be good enough at this stage of my research, or in terms of the clinical practices I want to affect, or the problem that I want to solve? Where do you come up with that? So just for example, let's say in an area that I've spent a lot of time on, which is depression and medical illness, we for many years have had kind of convention about how big of a difference between groups is clinically significant. We say, well, 2 or 3 points on a certain depression scale, that's clinically meaningful. And we almost never achieve that difference, but it's just been a convention that's kind of evolved over the years. What are you saying when you've worked long and hard to develop a new and better intervention, and you go out and tell the world, well, I'm going to go look for that same effect size that everybody else has been finding for 30 years. I'm not planning to do any better than that. Why should we want a trial that doesn't aspire to do any better than what everybody has done before? Sometimes that's a legitimate objective if you're trying to do a replication, or if you are taking an established intervention and applying it to a new population. Your hope is it'll work just as good for this new population as it's worked for other people. But if you're really trying to make some progress, if you're trying to do something new and better, maybe you want to have a threshold that's a little bit better than what's been achieved before. Maybe you define the threshold in terms of what's a big enough effect that it would give me a signal to move forward with the research. Or maybe it's a big enough effect that this would matter in terms of what the clinical guidelines are looking for. That's a kind of a question at a later stage of research. What's a big enough difference that the stakeholders, the clinicians or the patients would say, hey, this is big enough that I would be willing to go through this complicated, expensive intervention to achieve that. Or if it's a cheap, simple, fast intervention, maybe it takes less of a benefit in order for that to be worthwhile. Those are the really tough kinds of questions that you have to ask. It's not simply a matter of plugging a number from a little study into a bigger study. It raises all kinds of questions about what we are doing, why we were doing it, and what we hope to achieve. And that's why there isn't a simple answer to your question. It's a complicated thing that you have to think through.
Just to add to what Ken has eloquently really provided, as I think the most useful answer I've ever had, is doing sample size calculation for any trial is never an exact science. There's always a lot of uncertainty involved. I often encourage people to actually do a sample size table rather than a single value. And by so doing, you are actually acknowledging that even the estimate that you have, no matter how hard and thoughtful you could be about it, there's always be an uncertainty involved around it. So hey, doing a sample size for, a few values around what you have or you're anticipating would be the best estimate to work with. And of course, it's not only just the value of that estimate, it's the variability of that estimate that you also have to take into account. So I think a sample size table in designing studies is the best, most optimal way of being realistic about it because of the prevailing uncertainty that's always there in any trial.
Christine, do you want to add? You're on mute at the moment. There you go.
Yeah. No, I was just going to the icon, which didn't work. So I think I agree with both those speakers, and my experience is that I would do the table, and then you're going to look at the practicality of those sample sizes, and it's a a compromise between getting the ideal and getting something that you can reasonably deliver as a trial that you can also get funders to fund. So it's absolutely not a perfect science, but you importantly have to look at what is the difference, that the minimum difference really that would make it worthwhile to do the study. And certainly in the UK, we'll be wanting to know that this was a cost-effective intervention. So it also comes down to how expensive is the intervention. So you might be wanting a bigger effect from a very expensive intervention, whereas something which is quite easy to introduce, even if it has maybe only affects 10% of your patients, well, it didn't cost much, so it's okay, you know. So there's so many things to consider. It's not just one thing.
If I could expand just a bit on that, in the paper, I talk a little bit about number needed to treat, which is translatable into the success rate difference. There are widely used interventions that have very, very large numbers needed to treat, like low-dose aspirin for the prevention of heart attacks. I think the number is somewhere around 50, which means that for every 50 people that are taking low-dose aspirin, you might prevent one heart attack. That's okay because low-dose aspirin is cheap and widely available and relatively safe, as opposed to a complex, time-consuming, relatively expensive behavioral intervention. Nobody would go for it if the number needed to treat was 50. We need to aim for much lower numbers than that. On the basis of what you were saying, Christine, it's a matter of cost effectiveness. Is it worth going through or paying for an intervention? Depends on how complicated it is, and you expect more benefit for more people out of something that's resource intensive and burdensome than you do out of something that's simple. And that should be part of what drives our thinking about minimal clinically important differences or the threshold of clinical significance.
Can I just ask one quick follow-up to that?
Mm-hmm.
We're all doing behavioral interventions. If there is a drug option available, would it be fair to say that if our behavioral intervention can have the same level of efficacy as what we get on the drug side, that could justify the clinically significant target? In other words, some patients may not want to take drugs. They may want to look at a behavioral intervention instead. And so therefore, if we can do just as well as drugs do, then we're doing pretty well.
I think that's exactly the argument, that you're not always trying to do something better than what's available. Sometimes you're trying to create alternatives to what's available. And if that's your aim, if that's explicitly what you're chasing, then saying this intervention is as good as a drug for people that either can't tolerate the drug or are unwilling to take it or want to try something non-pharmacological first, that's a good rationale for aiming for that much of an effect.
Christine, you want to say something? Oh, you're on mute again. You're still on mute.
Yes.
There you go.
Now she's muted again.
I think you may be double clicking.
There.
Okay, right. As a pharmacist, I just really want to respond to that, because as pharmacists, we're really cautious about taking medicines because we know that absolutely no medicine is safe, because every medicine that has an effect will have a side effect. It won't necessarily affect everybody. So if you can do something behavioral, I think, in my opinion, it is just my opinion, the pharmaceutical industry won't like me for this, it's far better to have a behavioral intervention. And it also empowers people. But I guess the trouble is that not everybody is always willing to persist with the behavioral intervention. But we need, one of the things we need to do more is to persuade people that behavior is important in their life and that they can't just depend on taking medicines. There's just so many side effects from medicines. Even the low dose aspirin is not safe, not for everybody. So we really would be much better with your behavioral intervention.
Thank you for the plug. So I'm gonna ask a slightly different question, but actually it kind of extends from this. So obviously in our field, as Ken's highlighted, historically people have done these kind of PET studies and really focused on those those outcomes that they think are clinically important. And I think one of the key messages that people are picking up on, we've had a lot of questions around this, is that shouldn't be the outcomes of the feasibility and pilot studies, and that really we should be looking at other things. So, you know, more of the practical issues. So some of the things that have come up around issues about how do we start defining criteria that are good go, no-go criteria, how many things can we bundle into one particular study, and that we should, you know, is there an optimal level of number of things to be analyzing around feasibility in the PAF studies? And I know, having looked into this a lot, I know there's no definitive answer here, but maybe a little bit of guidance, because I think people are feeling a little anxious about some of these things would be great.
I'll start with the pilot and feasibility studies. I wish the answer was that simple. Unfortunately, it's not. And the reason being, if you think about what perhaps the interventional community has known for a long time, which is thinking about the clinical minimum or the minimal clinically important difference, no matter what perspective you take, there's still no consensus in many disciplines, no consensus in many outcomes. Now imagine trying to think about getting consensus or progression criteria for pilot and feasibility studies when we're still trying to figure out what the terms really mean and how to even best get people to report these things consistently. So I would say this is on our to-do list. But really, we try to get people to really think about things that would help them to be able to make realistic plans. It doesn't help to think about progression criteria that are very low and perhaps will be easy to achieve. And yet, when you go to the main thing, you realize that you actually misled by aiming too low, while in fact, you're just setting up yourself for disappointments when you go to the real thing. So it's a thoughtful process. And of course, having those criteria just allows you to be able to then have a sense of, have I been able to achieve that? What does this really mean? And what else do we need to do to be able to make the real thing? So it's a thoughtful process. At the moment, we don't have guiding principles about how to think it other than just be realistic. Try to aim too high to avoid disappointment.
Wonderful.
I agree with that. I think it's just so complicated. There's no single answer because it's got to be tailored to what you're wanting to do. But one of the key things that always strikes me from having been on research funding panels is the number of people that come back asking for extra time because they're not recruiting to target. And I've also been on steering committees, fortunately not my own committee, where we've actually been closed, the study's been closed down because they weren't recruiting to target. So I think it's really important to use that pilot trial to understand your recruitment approach and do enough what you might call a parallel process evaluation to understand if you're not recruiting well, why that's happening, and to get, I guess, stakeholder input to advise you on what you could do differently. So it's making sure that you accompany your main outcome with some measures which are about understanding what's gone on. So you can, as in that example I gave you from the decision trial, you can proceed but informed by your pilot.
Thank you.
I guess.
And I think that, sorry, and I think the care home example I gave at the beginning just made my mind blow when I looked at the 14 feasibility objectives that they had. So that seems to me too many, but there's no perfect number. It depends what you need to know, basically, and how much other people have done already for you in other published studies that you can build on.
There's a concept I talk about in the paper that I call the fallibility of feasibility. And that is, it's very important for us to work on feasibility and try to figure out, recruitment and retention and all those kinds of things in advance. But it's kind of like sending your kids off to college. You know, you've prepared as best you can, but at a certain point, you have to hope that things work out. And when you get very favorable, promising feasibility results, and you put it into your grant proposal and you convince reviewers that, hey, you know, we've really got this worked out. Recruitment's going to go well, and people are going to agree to do everything, and we have all our procedures working smoothly. And you get into the trial, and it gets off to a great start, and then you run into huge barriers, and you have trouble with recruitment or dropouts or things you didn't imagine were going to happen. And so all you can do is try, and doing feasibility pilot work is the way to try to work out feasibility questions as best you can. But I would say that you need to be prepared for unexpected problems and challenges and troubleshooting. Things always go wrong with trials, and you need to be prepared to try to work them out on the fly while you're doing the trial.
Mm-hmm. One comment I'll have, because I don't want to go too much time, but you know, one of the things I think, especially in the behavioral field, that we're very unprepared for is piloting recruitment of other sites. And that comes back to this issue of just recruitment in general. I think we're very good at doing single site studies and then planning to do multi-site studies without actually piloting that process. So that's a pitch that I'm making more broadly, that as we start to move forward in the field, that we really have to be cognizant of the complexities of bringing an extra site on board. And piloting is in its truest sense, is probably critical in that scenario.
I want to move on. We're getting an avalanche of questions here, and we're not going to have enough time to ask them all, but there's one that I think is potentially very important for investigators to buy into this idea of pilot and feasibility studies, and that is, can I publish these studies? And if I can't publish pilot and feasibility studies, what's the sense in doing them? You know, I need to get publications. So can you respond to that?
I think Lehana should respond, really, given that he's a co-editor in chief of a journal. But before I pass over to him, I absolutely agree with you. And our university has, in the past, I think things have moved on, but in the past have said to us, don't label a study as a pilot study, because you won't get it published in a good journal. And it's just that pressure that Lehana mentioned, almost like you're being pressurized to falsify your results in order to get it published. And that's morally wrong. And pilot studies do have a place in the literature, because one of the things we're looking at as a group is the validity of including them in a systematic review, because they could add patient numbers. So we definitely believe they're worth publishing for other people to learn from, and possibly just to build the body of evidence. Lehana?
I would actually add to this. I mean, part of why we started the work was what we thought was the tragedy of not having a lot of this work published. Research can only be research if it's useful, and it can only be useful if it's shared. And we strongly believe that we all have a scientific obligation, a moral obligation, and ethical obligation to do everything we can to publish every research we actually engage in. Even if something was so terribly done, there's always lessons to learn from it. I often actually say there's no bad study that goes to waste. It can always be used as a bad example. So I think we should do everything we can. The tragedy with pilot and feasibility studies that people tend to think they're studies that are really wasteful and therefore have nothing useful to share. And that's because of a wrong perspective about thinking of these studies as studies that are intended for statistical significance, while in fact, the message is simple. It's about feasibility. And I think reporting them appropriately is the best thing we can actually do. If you can't get them published anywhere in your clinical discipline, we provided a forum to be able to disseminate such studies. And our journal remains open to try and encourage everybody to share information.
I'd like to speak to this wearing my editor hat for health psychology. Early phase research in general, early phase intervention research is a continual headache for us to figure out how to think about it, how to evaluate it, how to encourage it, how to welcome it when it's good and interesting. And out of the difficulties that we have about all kinds of early phase or preliminary studies, some of the most difficult ones pertain to feasibility pilot studies, because they really are or should be designed to answer very practical questions about moving forward to an anticipated trial, which means that for most studies, the audience for that is kind of limited. Who cares about whether I can move ahead to a trial that I want to do? The reviewers of the grant application are going to care. My collaborators and I are going to care, but are you going to care as a reader? So we struggle with what is it about a paper like that anybody would want to read or cite? And we have to look for elements in there that would mean that this is a paper that's going to have some kind of an impact, some kind of interest. And we have the same problem with protocol papers. So protocol papers and pilot and feasibility studies, they're critical, they're very important, but they pose problems for many journals because we know that many of them are not going to get cited much, they're not going to get downloaded much, they're not going to be read very much. And so what I'm always appealing to authors to think about, well, what would make this interesting not only to you, but also to other people? Is there some aspect of it that would make it more worth reading or more worth citing? If you can develop that, then your chances of getting it published are better. And we have to make the same case with reviewers, that just because this isn't a full-fledged trial doesn't mean that it has no value. Look at it and think about it in terms of the stage of the research or phase of research that it represents. Is it a useful bit of research for what it is, not for what you think it ought to be?
I'm conscious of the time, so I'm just going to sort of follow up on that, make a small comment and a plea, because we've had lots of comments generally. So the first thing is that I think, Ken, one of the key things that you're highlighting is really situating that work in the bigger picture, which is something that is poorly done, and then what's the added value beyond the broadly people can extrapolate out of this potentially. So that I think is critical. And extending that point, one of the things that always comes up is about the funding issue and so on. And a large conversation that we've had, Kim and I have had with CIHR, which is the Canadian Institute of Health Research. We've had conversations with Susan potentially about doing some stuff around NIH, but it's really educating reviewers. And I'm pretty pleased to say that the panels that Kim and I have been able to sit on, we've done some very sort of short-term work around that, and I think IBTN has helped with this and so on. And we're now starting to see some traction where some of these kind of feasibility pieces of work are actually getting funded. But the key to getting them funded is that they're not standalone pieces per se, that they're actually being sold as, we've done some prep work, we're now at this phase, and we need this phase, and we have very clear goals of what we're achieving that, to then move forward to answer the much bigger question. And I think that is a fundamental shift conceptually. So there's a plea to everyone to start educating the reviewers on research panels and also reviewers about this process.
Also a comment on the value of these frameworks that we have. You know, these progressive frameworks, there's probably 10 or 12 of them now. If we put these studies within the context of a relevant framework, then the paupers become kings. They're not just little studies that are unimportant, but they become kings because they're a crucial step in the process of developing this behavioral intervention. Well stated, Simon.
Well, I'll leave you with a common proverb from the Ashanti people in Ghana. that you never really test the depth of a river with both feet.
What a way to end the session. We do have a ton of questions. What we're going to do is we'll try and get those to the panel and hopefully get the panel to answer those, and we can post those on the IBTM website, because we do have a lot, and I think this is a really critical area that people are looking for answers and looking for some guidance, and just even if it's positioning to other places. So
just one quick comment. First of all, this is fantastic, and I wish we could continue. I think, you know, it's such an important topic, as Simon said. The other thing too, I wanted to share a comment from one of the questions that came in. Lynda, Simon, you may have seen, but a lot of people are reacting and, you know, and calling this session quite transformative and disruptive and uncomfortable. And so I think that that's really important feedback I wanted to give to the panel right away, to say how important I think that this entire subject is in the field of not just behavioral medicine, but in general, and how I think we need to really, as a collective body, and be very strategic about doing this kind of training and teaching more widely. You know, I think we need to do it in Canada for sure, as Simon mentioned. I think maybe the US, because of all of, you know, the leaders in the US, Lynda, Ken, and others, and Susan Chakowski at NIH, have been so pioneering in getting these methods and frameworks out there. But I think so much work needs to be done. I can say for my own university, which is a big university here in Quebec, they've never heard of Orbit. Many have never heard of Consort. I go in there and I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm on a review, COVID-19 review panel now for CHR rapid calls. And all of this stuff that you mentioned today is stuff I'm directly seeing in the applications right now. In every application, the reason why I'm doing peer review this week of all weeks is because I feel just compelled to send on these messages through my review panel work. And it's one other way to get those messages out there and refer to all the papers that you mentioned today. So I want to thank you. And I think we're also going to probably reach out to you all down the line and not so distant future. And I think there's some other really important webinars perhaps we can put together to really kind of go on tour, as they say. And I think people have a little bit more time in the next few months, and maybe we'll get some captive audiences. We had a great showing today. And of course, we're going to be feeding back statistics to you all about who's downloading all the videos and who's watching these sessions. So I want to thank you all for taking the time, and for the attendees for sticking around. So thank you all so much. Lynda, don't go. I just don't know if you got my message, but just stick around for a few minutes after a little personal catch up for a second. But Christine, Lehana, it was so wonderful to meet you, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you for the invitation, Kim.
Yes, thank you.
Pleasure to have such wonderful colleagues to work with.
That's wonderful. And thanks, Ken. I think this whole session, was in part largely your suggestion in terms of recommending the panelists, and you're absolutely right as always. And so thank you so much for that. It's been wonderful getting to know you all.
It's been a pleasure.
All right, so thanks. Hope to see you in the sessions. The next sessions start. Oh, sorry, I'm taking Chris's job over as I always do. Sorry, I'm going to shut up now. Lynda, don't go, and Chris is just going to officially close out the session.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks to everyone for attending, and to all the IBTN team, and to all our speakers. That was really, really fascinating, and to, of course, our moderators as well for organizing the really important discussion afterwards. So I'll just remind you all that there is another session at 1 o'clock Eastern time, I think, if I'm getting my time zones correct. And it's on innovation in digital behavioral interventions. And all of this will be recorded, and you'll be able to access it in the next few weeks. So we'll leave it there. Thanks very much, everyone.